Well, hey everybody, I am no mad scientist, and I know as we approach the 50th Ranger, Nick, this is not going to be the one that comes off the rails. I'm standing in what looks like a chemistry lab out here at Southern Brewing Company, and I'm standing with Brian Roth. Brian, good to meet
Cheers,
you.
good to meet you, Nick.
Good to meet you. Co-owner out here at Southern Brewing Company. Brian, explain to me why we're standing in what looks like a chemistry lab and what this has to do with making beer here in Athens.
So, ironically, this is kind of the crux of everything we do. This is where everything starts. So people don't think of beer as being as scientific as it can be. It's very artisanal. We do a lot of stuff with recipes, but yeast is kind of the driving force of everything we do. So I would say the yeast is probably 75% of beer. It's the aroma, it's the flavor, it's how much alcohol ends up being in there. It's even how the CO2 kind of sets in a beer. So all this equipment is really geared towards us trying to make the best food or the best place or environment for yeast to kind of grow and prosper in, so that we get the qualities that we want on the backside. So it takes a good bit of science. And
it looks like it, and I've heard that the yeast in the brews that you use here at Southern Brewing Company is a locally grown yeast. Is that true?
That's true. We do use a commercial yeast for a big chunk of our beers, but we caught wild yeast off of an azalea here on the property before we cleared it. And then we caught a wild yeast off of a Cherokee Rose. Wow. Those two we just call wild azalea and Cherokee Rose because we're not very creative, probably. But
that's good.
It was an accident. They were the state flowers, so that was nice. But we get completely different qualities from them. So we house those currently at the University of Georgia. They were caught by myself and Dr. Jeff Rapp, who's head of microbiology at Athens Tech. And then we use Dr. Lanzalata at the University of Georgia and Dr. Bloom to help us process these yeasts. They store them for us so we can continue to use them, and we don't have to keep going back to the source.
Interesting. Well, we talk a lot about Georgia grown on the monitor. I want to talk about what's next, and that's making this stuff, taking the yeast, producing this beer. So let's check that stuff out next. Okay, so we learned that yeast is one ingredient that goes into making great beer here at SBC. What you're looking at here is barley, and this barley that I've got here, Brian, is cool looking stuff, but mine is a lot lighter colored than yours. What's going on here? That's dark, this is light. What's up?
So barley is kind of the backbone of the beer, and it's what we use to drive a lot of color and flavor. Both of these are two-row barleys, pretty much the exact same product, but this one's just been roasted longer. So both of these are going through a kilning, K-I-L-N-I-N-G process to dry the grain out and stabilize it, and also to caramelize some of the sugar. The more you caramelize it, the darker it gets. So this has much more of a coffee, kind of a burnt toffee profile. This is something you would put into a stout.
It does.
Although you would still probably have 80% of your recipe be this regular two-row. So it doesn't take a lot of these more complex, darker grains. And the roast varies depending on how much you want it. So like a little light Pilsner to something a little more red than that, all the way up to something that's darker than this where it looks almost burnt.
Wow.
And it tastes like black coffee.
That stuff's from England, this stuff's from Canada. I want to take the yeast part, the barley part, and learn about how other ingredients are involved. I want to talk about that next, so let's do it.
So to make beer, we got to take that grain that we just looked at, we got to crush it and mill it. So what we have is something that we call a mash tun or a lauter tun. These are all German terms. Basically, this is just a giant tea bag. So that grain comes through this grist auger, and it goes through this, which is a grist hydrator, and we hit it with water at about 160 degrees because we want this grain to steep at about 152. That's going to allow the enzymes in the grain to convert all that starch into sugar.
That's barley.
That's right. All right. And it's also going to allow those caramel compounds and those chocolatey compounds to come out if that grain is in there. And it gets the sugar where it needs to be before we need to boil it. So once this is done after about an hour, we'll pour it over to our boil kettle, and that's where we'll add hops, which is the other chief ingredient in beer. And these are pelletized. You can actually get hops in a whole cone flour, or you can get them ground and pelletized. We get the most quality out of this, so we get a lot of resin, a lot of aromatics. But the flowers are nice. They're a little more romantic when you throw those cones in there. This is going to give you a lot of aroma and the bitterness. So if you throw this into the boil kettle early, it's going to be all bitter. If you throw it in late, you're going to get all aromatic. So part of the recipe is figuring out which hops, what flavors you're going to want, what compounds you're going to want, and how to kind of tease those out when we get to the boil side on the kettle.
take a look at this huge container right here. All of those 4 ingredients that we mentioned earlier are all in here, and right now that yeast is feasting on all of those ingredients, and apparently those byproducts from the yeast is something that Brian is looking for to add to the taste of the beer. So Brian, the stuff is in here, it's fermenting, and Nick Fuhrman loves fermenting. It's a good thing, right? So there, it's all in there. Then what? What is happening from here?
Yeah, so we basically created a meal for the yeast itself. All that liquid's pumped into this tank, and it's about 65, 70 degrees is what the yeast that we're using right now likes to live at. And the yeast is chewing on this meal, and the 2 byproducts that we get off of that are ethanol, which is alcohol, and CO2. We also get a couple of other aromas and flavors depending on the yeast. So yeast does drive a pretty fair amount of the overall flavor potential, and like we said earlier, mouthfeel and everything else.
Yeah,
it's very crucial.
So, and the shape of this, what is the shape of this about?
So this is designed because yeast, when it gets cold, it's on our side of the animal kingdom, it wants to clump together.
Okay.
The yeast doesn't have clothes, so the colder it gets, the more it starts to clump. And just like us, if we all started clumping together and we're in a big body of water, we would start to sink. So this is designed to get that yeast chilly, sink it so that all the solids come into here, and then we can catch that yeast back and use it again. It's called a slurry. It allows us to keep that yeast going. Otherwise, you would just have to dump it all. But we do take the yeast solids and some of the proteins and the hops that settle out, and we'll pump those into our spent grain tote.
So the spent grain, where's that going? Throwing it out, or what are you doing?
Yeah, no, luckily, spent grain, we have a local farmer that comes and picks up our spent grain. He feeds all of his livestock with it. We pump yeast, we pump hops in there. Even if we have a little extra spent beer, sometimes we'll pump it in there, but we try to get it so that everything's fairly sustainable. We're a very green industry, and we kind of always have been because we grew up with agriculture.
It's such an important part, and you ended with agriculture. Brian, thank you so much for sharing all this local ag. Appreciate you being on with me. Y'all check out the Southern Brewing Company website there on the screen, and while you're online, check out the Georgia Farm Monitor Facebook and the Ranger Nick's Facebook page. I love it when you do that. And until next time, for the Farm Monitor, I'm Ranger Nick. As we always say, an enthusiasm is contagious. So pass it on.
Cheers.
Y'all, thanks so much for watching. We look forward to seeing you when we get back together again next month. See ya.
Cheers.